Hello and welcome to episode 25 of the Rogue Health Economist podcast. We are talking about trauma all week, and what a time to be doing it. I'm really excited to have today on the podcast my friend Niki Gratrix, as well as being the host or one of the hosts of the upcoming Trauma Super Conference that's coming up at the end of the month. She is also someone who's been involved clinically in research and all areas of this over the last couple of decades. So welcome, Niki.
Thank you very much for having me, James. It's great to be here.
I really want to talk a little bit later just about sort of like the moment that we're in right now. But I guess, just one of the things I wanted to start with, obviously we're in a moment that is like fairly traumatic for everyone. I think there's no safe position. COVID was traumatic. The riots are traumatic. There's no real safe place to be for anyone at this moment. And I guess I just wanted to start by asking, are there any, I know when you do a summit, because I've done a few of them myself, there's this interesting moment where you've recorded all the stuff and you know what's coming and no one else knows. And yet, and you can see that maybe there's going to be some nice connections, and particularly for this. So are there some interviews that you did that you're excited to sort of unleash upon the world, especially now?
Yeah, definitely. It's such an important timing and topic. So, one of the things of the themes that's come up on the summit is we have this thing called, the word trauma is wildly overused, by the way, and we have the word trauma. Developmental trauma is different from, for example, PTSD. Developmental trauma is by far the most common type of trauma. It's to do with how well we attach with our key caregivers in childhood. And the reason that it's important is because it's the quality of our social relations in childhood which gives us the resilience to deal with events in adulthood, the inevitable traumatic events that happen in adulthood, the death of a loved one, being in a car accident, what's happening right now. So our perceptions and our strength and our resilience and our ability to cope with events like what's going on now are defined by and set up by our childhood relations. So it's not only, it's also, by the way, how likely we are to develop PTSD in response to discrete events is dependent upon the quality of our social relations in childhood. The quality of our social relations in childhood trumps PTSD. So now is the time more than ever for people to understand how their early life stresses have affected them, how that may have made them more or less resilient to what's happening now, including social distancing. For some people, that's a disaster with some of their upbringings, and it's going to just create more stress for them. So, it's a very important topic to bring up right now. Not only for that, but also because early life stress is probably the number one most underexposed risk factor for all chronic complex illness. So it's a really massive silent epidemic happening that's affecting people's health, affects your psychology, how well you cope with stress and events in adulthood. What could be more important than that?
Yeah. Obviously in functional medicine, we talk about getting to the root cause. And I think that, a lot of times we talk about sort of, the sort of day-to-day, things that we do being a root cause, what we eat and how we sleep and exercise and those kind of things, but yet most of us kind of are aware of what's healthy for us and what's not, and yet a lot of us do unhealthy things continuously. And that seems, the more I learn about it, the more it's trauma is at the heart of of whether or not we can actually do things that are healthy for ourselves.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So if we have unresolved trauma from childhood that we're not aware of, there's a level of pain that we're carrying around, and we'll basically do things to avoid feeling the pain. And it can manifest as workaholism and addiction to work, and not doing the self-care and not making time to have a healthy lifestyle. There's the obvious food addictions. Actually, early life stress, adverse childhood events are the number one, probably most underexposed risk factor for all addiction as well. So it's, when it's a bit surface, when all we look at is like, we can tell people what to do and we can give great practical recommendations about what to do, but whether they can actually motivate themselves to do that is dependent on the inner psychology, the inner motivation and the drive to do it. And there's the self-sabotage. If there's unresolved trauma, it's basically pain, the pain body, as I think it was Eckhart Tolle calls it, the pain body, right? We all relate to that to some degree. So we're carrying that around with us. It's unresolved. It's really hard to stick to a program or make these changes, deep enough that we actually stick to them long term for them to make a significant difference. So it's massive on many levels.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about adverse childhood events because ultimately I know you have a lot of expertise in that, and I know we've talked about that before, and I'd love to just bring this up here as part of this week. And I guess, more importantly than anything, just to be, I guess, culturally sensitive at this moment, I think there's a lot more trauma associated with growing up being Black in America, right? Crime and absentee fathers and prison rates and all of that stuff. If you take a holistic viewpoint at it, there's a lot of trauma that's being delivered there, and ultimately you can see that that ultimately, one, the tables have to kind of turn, and two, that there'll be a lot of like trauma-induced behavior that comes as a result of it. And I guess I just wanted to dive into some of the statistics or some of the data about childhood events and how they affect health and what the mechanism is.
Yeah, so it's a massive one. I mean, when we talk about early adverse childhood events, we're talking about things like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parents separating or divorce, substance abuse in the family, domestic violence, and it also includes being, a victim of racism, of homophobia, of all those kind of things. That all kind of counts and can all affect the identity and the ability to self-regulate our nervous system. All those things because it's developmental, because it's while our bodies and brains are still developing. Our brains don't develop in social isolation, and we don't exist in a vacuum. Our brains develop in response to what's happening around us socially, which is very important. And all of that has a dramatic impact on health, on also our ability to have positive social relations in adulthood as well. But just to give you a little bit on this, on the data, because it's so important. So it's a massive studies that started in the mid-1990s, done by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, studying over 17,500 adults. Basically, over 67% of all of those adults said they'd had some level of adverse childhood experiences, and 80% of them said it was more than one. If you have a high level of ACEs, you have a dramatic increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. If you have 6 ACEs, you have a 20-year reduction in lifespan. If you have 4 ACEs, you have a 400% increased risk of depression, anxiety, Alzheimer's, dementia. You're more than 12 times as likely to be suicidal. If you have 2 ACEs, you're 100% more likely to get autoimmunity in adulthood. If you have ACEs in childhood, you have a 6-fold increased risk of chronic fatigue. I mean, it's name the illness and I can tell you the stat on it. And it's also, if you have 4 ACEs, you're more than 7 times as likely to become an alcoholic, or 11 times as likely to use injection drugs. And by the way, just on this addiction piece, the sad thing is that we've got all this mental illness and this addiction that is really coming from adverse childhood events, and we're criminalizing it. So that's another thing that's happening right now, that where we need to get the message out there that people, it's not a mistake that they behave the way. It's actually an adaptive survival strategy. That's what we do in childhood when we don't get the love that we need, the attention, the validation, the connection, the feeling like we're important, that we're wanted, that we have purpose in life, that there's meaning to why we're here, that we are lovable. If we don't get those messages in childhood, then we do all the kind of stuff. We get ill, we get chronic complex illnesses, we go maybe into rebellion mode where we just fight all authority figures, or we do the opposite, we become too obsequious. So we get obsequiousness as well, all this kind of stuff. But so much of what we see that's happening in culturally and health-wise, the crucial developmental trauma is the number one most important thing we should be talking. How do we bring up our children? It's a sign of a civilized society, is how well we look after our children. And unfortunately, the data's, it's not great. We, when our kids are too rambunctious, we put them on drugs to kind of keep them quiet. And, some of the devastation that's causing for a next generation is something that we really need to look at it. And the other thing is, I just want to say this as well. You know, if we are traumatized in childhood, we create adaptive styles to cope with that in childhood. Then we continue those behaviors and styles of interacting as adults. And we tend to pass that stuff on to our children that we have. And this is how the cycle continues. So one of the reasons to become trauma informed, to become trauma aware, to look at maybe your own styles, your own history, do your own ACE score, check that out, maybe get some therapy, maybe start, you know, at least investigating if this might have affected you. If you clean up your trauma, you're not only healing it for your entire ancestral lineage, you're also not going to pass that on to your children ultimately, and that's going to create a better world for everybody, including lower health costs for your kids as well. So,
well, let's talk about those costs, because I mean, ultimately what I hear you saying is that this could be like the #1 driver of this massive expansion in cost, because we have seen that chronic disease is driving it. You know, I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about is just like, it seems like what trauma we carry forward into adulthood from childhood is a function of, one, how much trauma happened, and secondly, of like how you were able to unwind it like at that moment. And I would imagine that sort of the destruction of community probably plays a role in that, because maybe grandma or other elders in the community played a role in helping kids, you know, deal with trauma, that once we have, you know, smaller households and individual households, there's not another person in to support.
Yeah, absolutely. The lack of the extended family, and we just sort of have this little nucleus of maybe just 4 people, parents and 2 children, and with the sort of the pressures of work that adults are under now, they're, you know, they're even less available and less present, you know, for their children, and there isn't the extended family around, especially if you're also moving around a lot because the job takes you to different countries, so you're away from the grandparents. Yes, that's absolutely definitely a massive factor. One of the people that I interviewed for the Trauma Summit was a brilliant psychologist called Dr. Jonice Webb, and she's focusing on childhood emotional neglect. And her book, Running on Empty, has gone, it's gone crazy. There's the level of emotional neglect happening where essentially all we're doing with our kids is kind of like shoving them into the car. We can take care of them physically, we can drive them to school, here's your lunch, but don't expect a conversation about emotions and how they're feeling. So we have a whole generation, an epidemic of a lack of emotional intelligence really as well. People not really feeling connected to their feelings, and that's like a doorway to, you know, people's self-worth, who they are in the world. So having these vital emotional skills, they are passed to us again in childhood. That's how we learn. You know, if our emotions are never connected with, we're never sort of validated or seen emotionally, but somebody can totally be there physically, that's another silent epidemic which is happening right now, that's having a huge impact on adults. And people, I would say, you know, go and read the book if you resonate with any of that, because most people, every person that I recommend read that book goes, oh my God, that's me, that's part of my history. And so it really is epidemic as well. But it's another example of what a silent ACE. You see, emotional neglect isn't about an event, it's about what didn't happen, which is really hard to self-report. And that's also why the ACEs study, it was a great study, a fantastic study, but it's quite superficial. And probably the reality, that was the tip of the iceberg. The reality is a lot worse than that, because we missed a lot of these more subtle questions to elicit things like emotional neglect. It's a massive topic. So yeah, I hope that makes sense as well, in the sense that it's a lot wider and a lot deeper than people have recognized. Trauma doesn't just mean you were hit by a car. It doesn't just mean you had sexual abuse. Trauma can also come from being profoundly emotionally neglected as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I you know, one of the things that I wanted to just chat with you about was just like how early can this start? Because one of the really interesting things that I learned about in the last few years as I was researching the group visit phenomenon in integrative and functional medicine was centering pregnancy. And centering pregnancy was essentially a way for mothers to essentially come together into sort of cohort groups and to build new communities of mothers while they're pregnant. And ultimately what they saw is, just by putting women together in groups and having them, connect for a few weeks before and after giving birth, in some cases quite a few weeks, they were able to reduce preterm birth by 35%. It flattened the racial disparities between mothers who were giving birth in Connecticut and South Carolina. And ultimately, it seems like somewhere in there is like there's a sort of a pre-birth trauma that's happening where mother is socially isolated and perhaps brings a baby into the world who is jacked with all kinds of stress hormones.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Another person I interviewed on our summit, Dr. Lawrence Heller, who's one of the world leading experts in developmental trauma, and he points out in his book as well that this very early trauma, sort of before 6 months, which is obviously precognitive, there's no thinking brain, we're just a ball of a sponge of emotions, if you like, at that age. If there isn't good bonding and connection between mother and baby in that first 6 months, and if mum is stressed and depressed during pregnancy, that is definitely being transmitted. The data's there, that is transmitted to the child. And it's that we certainly know if there's trauma in that first 6 months as well. That is, so failure to bond, like mum she could be depressed, she could have too much on her plate, she could have problems with other children, there's a whole, obviously, plethora of reasons why she might not be able to be fully available to the child. But that very early stage is actually the most critical. So when we have what's called an adaptive style called connection trauma, it happens that very early stage. That has profound impacts, not just on the baby psychologically, but also it turns very physiological. That little child will not be able to self-regulate physiologically or psychologically either. So it's a crucial period. So the more that we can do in that first period, like, bringing people together, social groups, everything that builds community support for mums during pregnancy and in those first 6 months, is absolutely critical, because it does look like that is a time that can have the most negative impact long term on the child. It's very painful experience for a child. Literally, if a child doesn't feel seen and loved at that age, they disassociate. That's one of the coping mechanisms, and they basically go into a sort of state of I don't exist. I don't exist because there's nobody there connecting with me, and I disappear. And the level of self-hatred that will stay with that child through your lifetime, from that kind of disconnect and attachment trauma at that age, it's really profound. The imprint is profound. And unfortunately, you see that a lot in the chronic fatigue community, for example. There's certain types of illnesses that often show up with the different stages of development as well from childhood. So yeah, couldn't agree more that that's a crucial period where we definitely want to do the best that we can to support parents as much as the children during that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to just, I guess, I think anyone who's done any research in this world, or anyone who's come face to face with it, realizes that we're not really going to solve this if we don't go upstream. Right. And if we're dealing with like the chronic disease as a result of the trauma, as a result of the, all of this, it just keeps on compounding and compounding and compounding. And hence maybe why some of these numbers like chronic disease just keeps going up and up. And as an economist, as someone who's interested in flattening the curve of healthcare costs, I feel like, what we really have to do is scale up solutions to deal with this. And I guess I would love to just, tap into some of your experience, because I know that you've interviewed people and you've done a lot of content, but I know that you work with a lot of people for a long time. And I guess I would just wanted to tap into some of your experience as to what are some strategies that you've seen to work first, what works best, and then maybe second, we can get into, scalable and efficient ways of delivering that, so that this could be something that could be rolled out inside either inside the medical system or inside community or inside social services or wherever it needs to be delivered.
Yeah, so the framework that we've used in the summit is kind of summarizes some of the key points for people to take away. So we know that the conventional approach, especially to sort of mental health and mental wellness, it falls so far short. It's very bad news at the moment. But we could equally look at a lot of the natural medicine approaches. There's a lot of fragmentation. There's still a lot of reductionism. So, practitioners are working with clients. Maybe, they're focused on 100% just talking about the gut. Because that's what they know and how they recovered, rather than taking a fuller systems approach. So there's still a lot of issues in the conventional medicine, the naturopathic medical community. And the point being that we want a bottom-up and top-down approaches. So one of the things we did in the summit is we wanted to have like the psychology community understand that there are tons of functional medicine approaches that make a tremendous difference to your health and well-being, your mental and physical well-being. And the psychologists are not really aware of it. Simple things to start out with that we repeated multiple times. Eat a diet that manages your blood sugar. I know that sounds like, oh God, we're going to talk about blood sugar control. I can't tell you how important that is, but how it's practical and easy, relatively easy to do. Protein at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Don't miss breakfast if you can. Have a high protein breakfast. Some of the. I don't know if you want me to go into some of the practical things on blood sugar control.
I guess I do want to get into just like what the solutions are, and then we can talk about like how to get there. So, absolutely agreed that like there are physiological effects from, that affect you in a mental way, and that ultimately there are ways to be able to regulate your physiology 100%. And so that needs to be a part of the conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is what we wanted to try and get across. Like, if you have trauma and you've had trouble regulating your emotions, you are in chronic anxiety, bipolar depression, you're just, having trouble mentally and physically. There are these things like blood sugar control, circadian rhythm management, like just be able to go to bed a little bit earlier, get bright sunshine in the first 30 minutes on waking. Have campfire light in the evening time, get the blue blocking glasses, get the screen time away at night, have a completely dark room at night. That's Harvard research based work on improving sleep. We have to have good sleep. If the psychology community knew more about some of these basic things that people could do practically at home, half their anxiety would probably go away. I think there are people being diagnosed with bipolar and they just have a blood sugar imbalance, and that it could be corrected with these practical lifestyle things. Obviously regular exercise can make a tremendous difference to how healthy and well you feel. And that's the message to people who've, they already know they've had trauma. The circadian rhythm, blood sugar control, time in nature, sunlight's incredibly important. A home chemical cleanup, all of the chemicals and the toxins that we're exposed to, all of that stuff that is lifestyle dietary recommendations that are part of the functional medicine contribution are profoundly important. And then there's also going to see at the professional level, going to see a professional practitioner who can assess for things like the great pretenders, like thyroid dysfunction, other things like the sex hormone imbalances, gut dysbiosis, problems with the gut. All of those things have a profound impact on mental health. So we care about all those things. That's part of the story. What we'd call with that, those are bottom-up approaches. For trauma resolution, we also want the top down. We also want the functional medicine community to be more aware about the impact of early life stress, the difference between PTSD and developmental trauma. That's one thing I've really wanted to get people out there. We use the word trauma. Most people think of PTSD. That's in response to a discrete event, like being in a car crash or being the victim of an assault, for example. We get post-traumatic stress in response to discrete events. That's not what developmental trauma is. PTSD is relatively rare. And if you speak to Bessel van der Kolk, world leading expert on trauma, he'll tell you it's pretty curable. And actually, for PTSD, just go and get some EMDR. That's the frontline conventional intervention, conventionally backed, well-researched eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. So PTSD, relatively curable. The problem area, the deeper work that takes longer to address is the developmental trauma. It's the attachment type trauma, because that leads to more chronic nervous system dysregulation, more of the chronic, it impacts how we behave, like having addictive behaviors and not taking care of ourselves as well. So that's where we want to get more trauma informed, the difference between PTSD, developmental trauma. I'd encourage people to look into NARM therapy. which is Dr. Lawrence Heller's book, his therapy he created. Dr. Lawrence Heller, his book is Developmental Trauma, Healing Developmental Trauma. And that's a model where you can start to understand what's happening with people, what the results are of the different types of malattachment and attachment issues and attachment styles. And then you can start to understand, you can start to translate and go, oh, I'm going to see there's going to be a problem here. This person isn't going to be able to stick to my functional medicine practical recommendations because they're carrying around too much emotional stress. And you know, the key thing that my talk is love is the best medicine. The degree to which someone has attachment trauma is the degree to which they have self-hatred. And we have an incredible amount of self-rejection and self-hatred that we're carrying around in society. It's only half, people are only really half aware of it. It's a lot of unconsciousness that we're carrying around this. And if you think of the work of Bruce Lipton and many of the other people a bit more on the quantum physics side, you know, our cells are listening to us. The cell danger response, we talk about the cell danger response of Dr. Robert Navio's work, where we now know that the mitochondria aren't just energy production, they're also listening to whether or watching out for threats. If we did not feel safe in childhood, we're sending a chronic message to the cells of our body that we are not safe. And that is switching, the entire body is turning into a fight-flight response. And that is fast track to health issues. We know that stress is incredibly destructive. Most people think that stress is, you know, I've got too many phone calls to make, I need to run the kids to school, I've got that kind of surface level stress. No, most people are carrying stress. The vast majority of stress is actually built into our systems, and it's to do with our identity. It's to do with distorted versions of reality that we got from our parents who didn't see us, who didn't validate us enough, gave us conditional love, this kind of thing. So it's really, do you see what I'm getting at? It's kind of this inborn dysregulation that's already there. It's not even about your workload and how busy you are. It's already in the system, and it's how, you know, it's the perfectionism, it's being a super achiever, the people who are the overgivers. That's all fast track to burnout. We learned those are adaptive styles from childhood. So that has to be part of a recovery for people, to start understanding, start looking at your personality typing. The Enneagram personality type system is actually still a great system that we still use clinically. You can put enneagraminstitute.com, go and do the quiz on there, and they have the giver type, the perfectionist, the achiever type, the anxiety type. Those are all adaptive styles that we picked up from childhood, and they're often not so good at them. They were good for childhood, and they were a wise response to survive childhood, but they're not relevant now in adulthood. And we can, recognition is the first step one, awareness. Oh, I have the giver type attachment style. Oh, you know, I have the anxiety type. So awareness is step one. And then we can start to unpick the conditioning and look at various different therapies that are available for that. And we covered the whole lot. We covered yoga therapy could be tremendously important. Somatic experiencing as applied to developmental trauma can be wonderful. Pretty much everything that you can do to help that side, even if it was just awareness and doing questionnaires and things like that. So yeah, that's it. So we need the bottom up and top down approaches. And the more people can get self-informed and self-educate and become sophisticated about it, the better, because there's no way that the conventional medicine approach is going to save you. And if you think that you're going to be saved, or that some money is going to be in a pot for you at the end, these issues aren't curable with a pill. It's systemic, and it's how we live our daily lives and how we respond to ourselves and feel about ourselves every day. And you can't fix that with a pill.
Yeah. Look, I really appreciate you sharing it. There's a few thoughts I have. I mean, the first thing I want to say is that, like, I think as a community in functional medicine and beyond, you know, there's going to have to be a real realization of the things that we've termed lifestyle illness is really not, in a lot of cases, lifestyle related. It's actually just environmental issues that some people can't afford to avoid, right? And so that's a big thing. But more than that, you know, I guess we could sit here and hope that the functional medicine practitioners get better at, you know, at this, and that these people get better at that. But ultimately, what I'm committed to in this decade, as opposed to last decade, where I was thinking, okay, maybe that's the plan. If we could just get functional medicine doctors to get a health coach and do groups and use technology, then that'll be great. And if we could just get therapists to understand that there's physiological issues why they're sick, then that would be great. I have to say, I feel evolved out of that idea, which is really that we just need to build a system that incorporates all of these kind of things. Because ultimately, the building of that system that uses functional medicine doctors when they're appropriate, that uses, the mental health practitioners when they're appropriate, but don't expect them to know everything about each other. And ultimately, what we really need to do is to take people on a journey of self-discovery where they can determine, is that useful for them? And then to use that. And the biggest thing is that a lot of the things that you mentioned, are unattainable to most people financially until you do it in a group. And once you start doing it in a group, the economics completely transform, in that the peer-to-peer delivery of value is basically free. And that ultimately, as we start to help people, like you look at someone like Jim Gordon, right, who's taking mindfulness-based stress reduction into Kosovo and to, Puerto Rico after the hurricane, and to Gaza, like the most traumatic place on the planet, and is seeing, ridiculous results by getting people into groups and having them do 11 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Like, these are things that really work. And ultimately, when we do them in groups, we take them from being like things that only certain people can afford to do outside of their health plan to things that are really affordable. And I'm committed to, building structures that allow this kind of care to be delivered to people, because ultimately, we have to bend the curve. If we don't bend the curve, we're going to run out of money. Like, what percentage of GDP can we reach before like healthcare, evaporates every other discipline and every other industry? So, I really appreciate, the reason why I wanted to ask you about what works is because I think it's important to take what we've learned in the last 2 decades as far as what really works. And that's why top down, bottom up, mental health, physical health, and that connection, all of that is important. But I think it's really important now that the people who are in the position to build the future and build structures using technology and using those resources that can scale this kind of care up to everyone, so that we have a shot to do that. And a big part of that is empowerment. And so I think, like you said, like using tools like your summit where people can listen for free and learn as much as they can, that can stop them from having to wait until someone builds the solution and actually sort of get into it right here and right now. So I guess I just want to acknowledge you, Niki, for like doing the work for a couple decades, and now looking for ways to scale up the information to people. And you guys have been great with getting the summit going. And for anyone who's watching, if you go to findfunctional.com/trauma, you can register for free. There's some incredible gifts there that you can get right away if you register even today. You can check out some of the sessions, and you can check out some of the other tools. Thank you for being part of the Rogue Health Economist. And I think if there's one thing that I've learned during this week of Trauma Week, is that if we want to be the root cause people, we're really going to have to look at what the real root causes are. And I see so many things that seem like the root cause is laziness or apathy or those kind of things, that actually is rooted in kind of systemic oppression of one way or another, and also is rooted in just an inability for most people to buy their way out of unhealthy environments, and that can be environments of all sorts. So yeah, thank you for being part of the podcast.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, and I encourage people to go to the summit. I do think summits are a very low-cost way of people getting like a smorgasbord and a taster of all the different things out there. And the key thing is, I think, self-education is going to be massive. Like, for going forward, like, if, as you say, there isn't going to be the money there. It is going to have to collapse at some point. It's not a sustainable model that we're in. So the more that people can get self-educated now through something like we've got over 90 speakers, and it's like, for 50, I think $59, you can buy the summit. 90 speakers, world experts at each in their area. So I know we've got a bit of summit fatigue going on, but I still think it's got a value, the summit model of the helping people, like you say, on the low cost, who have, the economically challenged and so on. So Thanks very much for having me on, James, for all the work that you do as well. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Nikki. All right, so check out findfunctional.com/trauma. Check out the summit. You can get the free gifts now. Thanks for listening to the Rogue Health Economist. Tomorrow, I think I'm just going to come in and bring together some of the pieces that have come together this week. And next week, we're actually going to speak to some actual economists, because I'm kind of a fake economist in that I have a degree in it, but I'm an entrepreneur more than anything. But next week, we're going to hear from Toby Rogers. We're going to talk about the economics of chronic disease. We're going to hear from Nick Bloom, who's a Stanford economist, who's going to be talking about the costs of lockdown and some unpopular truths about where we have found ourselves in. So we'll see you next week on the Rogue Health Economist. Actually, I'll be back same time, same place here tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.